Hi, everyone. Today's guest is Tucker, the apparently tireless and unflaggingly devoted heart and mind behind Dracula Beyond Stoker. This magazine is a digital and print publication which does its part in preserving the legacy of Bram Stoker's seminal gothic novel. Stoker's story, despite predecessors like Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla or John Polidori's The Vampire, remains the most famous and influential of vampire stories. From the OG Nosferatu's Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck, to Willem Dafoe playing Max Schreck, playing Count Orlok in Shadow of the Vampire, from the erotic fascination of Anne Rice or the Twilight series, the abjection of 30 Days of Night, the melancholy of Let the Right One In, the ferocity of Thirst, and the hilarity of What We Do in the Shadows, the fascination with the vampire as monster object is very much alive, or should we say undead, in the cultural imagination, to speak nothing of the veracity of folklore. Even more than the sanguine specter of the vampire as a monster, Stoker's Dracula leans heavily on famously gothic tropes and motifs, which I refer to as the love beast. A love beast being something terrible and inhuman, but seductive and agonizing. Dracula makes the vampire a monster that young girls might eroticize in their imaginations, a dark and mysterious stranger from another land, one who has crossed oceans of time to find them. Dracula Beyond Stoker features original fiction by contemporary writers, imagining the characters, the locations, the events, and even Bram Stoker himself in various potential iterations and incarnations. The catalog is an invitation to participate in something timeless and irrefutably ingrained within our collective imaginations, to be a part of a waking, breathing mythology, to, if we are so lucky, be selected to contribute to the expansion of that mythology. In addition to a series of unique stories which grow the canon of Dracula, each publication features original and thematic art. The quality of the cover art was what first fascinated me about these issues. The unique color-drenched paintings are reminiscent of the delicious pulpiness which has been gradually replaced by AI designs and clip art pastiche. I was also taken in by the staggering amount of love, devotion, and perhaps even obsession it takes to maintain the steady tributary stream the magazine feeds into the Dracula River. Tucker really loves Dracula. One might even posit that he's become something of a less addled and more charming Renfield, allowing author after author to spill a little of their creative lifeblood to keep the Count and his growing mythos more alive and mesmerizing than ever. Thank you so much for being here, Tucker.
I'm glad to be here. I love talking Dracula, and I'm so glad that you shouted out the cover art because I love our cover art.
I mean, it reminds me of when you're going through a used bookstore and you get to pick up those really good 60s, 70s kind of pulpy covers. They suck you in, they're super absorbing, and we have all these really generic cut and dry covers now. But the fact that you really have that flair for the drama, for the spectacle in the cover art, I think really does Dracula justice as well, too, right? Gothic genre is over the top.
Well, a major inspiration for what we're doing is the pulp magazines of the like 30s and 40s. So I love weird tales. I love horror stories and strange tales, stuff like that. And they always had great cover art. I think
Absolutely.
I think even in my submission call for it, because the art is all submitted as well as the
Mhm.
stories. I believe in my submission call, I even say try to look towards the old pulp magazines for inspiration.
Yeah. Totally. And you see, I mean, it's really high quality too. Like the artists are extremely professional and their sort of imaginal conjurations of the characters feel really visceral, feel really tangible, feel really like easy to believe or sink your quote unquote teeth into as representations. But I want to ask you this question that I want to ask everyone, right? Because this is sort of the theme of this whole project, and it's about monsters. It's about monstrosity, and Dracula is one of those ones that immediately comes to mind for most people, right? Not just vampires, period, but Dracula specifically. And when I use the word monster, like, would you even agree that Dracula is a monster, or what is monstrous about him in the context of all of your extensive work and research that you've explored?
So that's something that like I think about my relationship with monsters all the time because like the ones that I like and the ones I've been a horror fan my entire life, not just vampires, not just Dracula. And the ones that I gravitate towards are the ones like Dracula and Freddy Krueger. They're the ones that are they're not apologetic, they're not sympathetic at all. Like Jason and Michael Myers might as well be the shark from Jaws. They're just running through, and Frankenstein has sympathetic qualities. The Wolfman, when he's human, he's not a monster, and he wishes he wasn't a monster.
Yeah.
But Dracula knows he's a monster, and Dracula revels in it. that's the monsters that I find most interesting. You know.
I love it. These ones that aren't in pursuit of integrating humanity, aren't here to try and incorporate or pass more on the inside. You're right. You bring up like Frankenstein, where there's this really existential and philosophical sort of desire or compulsion to have an affinity with mankind that over and over again Frankenstein is constantly reminded he cannot have, right? But yeah, Dracula is such a great foil in that context because he revels in that sort of power, in that otherness, in that separation. I mean, that's part of his primary appeal, right? And even courting before some of the people in the story even realize what he is.
Yeah, and he has a plan to spread his disease, really. you know, and he even taunts them at one point. He's like, I all your women are mine. He's like, he knows that he's ruining lives, and he doesn't care.
I love that. Yeah, that's I think almost a with the story in the popular imagination, I think, especially thanks to the film, right? It's very easy to fantasize or attach to the romantic kind of soulmate connotations. I know I see a lot of people specifically reposting those kind of scenes, talking about those scenes, but there is that brutalism, there is that terror, there is an agenda underneath all of the romantic kind of trope too, right? Like that's
Yeah,
absolutely
and that romance doesn't really exist in the novel. You know,
yes.
he's his landing up with Jonathan's people is really just like a cruel coincidence.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's again one of those things where we see the way in which like a Hollywood adaptation is going. How do we make a wider audience interested in this monster story, right? Like we can bring in that, but I think the kind of erotic and grotesque fixation with Dracula has now grown out of the corpus itself, right? We see that as such a popular
Oh yeah,
theme in the way vampires are regarded writ large in culture.
it pops up all the time, and it even goes back to the '70s. I think the Dan Curtis film was the first one to actually make that connection, and then it traveled through to the Coppola film.
Yeah,
I think we're starting to get away from it because he's the last couple movies he's a monster again.
it's true. Yeah.
Nick Cage is a monster. In The Invitation, he's a monster. The Last Voyage of Demeter, he's a monster.
Yeah.
So I think
Yes.
we're getting back to the beginning, even though they're not doing great at the theater. But
Yeah, yeah. That's the last voyage of Demeter in particular. Hard time with that one. I'm actually curious now that you bring that up, right? That we're noticing this zeitgeist away from the eroticization of Dracula back into his role as a sort of dark or fearsome specter. What do you think might be shaping that? Do you think people just finally like tapped out of being sort of force fed the vampire love story and now they're ready for the brutalism again?
well, I think it has to do with Dracula doesn't go away,
Mm,
but he adapts to whatever the zeitgeist is at the time. And anytime we have any kinds of wars or conflicts going on,
yeah,
people like monsters.
yeah,
That's when the Universal monster movies started back in the 30s, and in the 50s during the Korea, and in the 70s was when the slashers started. But people people really like monsters during times of conflict for some reason or other. I think in the 90s when Coppola came along, that was when vampire stories were tending to be allegories about the AIDS epidemic,
yeah,
and that's why I think the love story, the romance came into it because they're trying to associate it with sex,
yeah.
and there was a whole lot of there was a whole lot of AIDS-related vampire stories back in the 80s and 90s,
Yeah.
and I think that was the pinnacle of it.
I really am compelled by this point you bring up too, right? About the fixation, the revival, the attachment to the quote unquote like imaginal monster as a way of processing, making meaning of, and understanding like the very real cultural, socio-political monstrosity that we are forced to contend with, and in many ways, like necessarily inundated with, too, on the day to day, with abstracting it, taking it into this thing where we can open a book and close a book gives us some like level of control, right, over something that otherwise feels immensely powerless and futile.
Yeah, and another thing about Dracula that falls into the conflicts that we're in right now is Dracula was always the way Stoker imagined it. He was the immigrant,
Yeah.
and our all our conflicts right now are all about immigration.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I think that has a lot to do with why Dracula is becoming a monster again,
Yeah.
because we're making a monster out of the other.
I love that. I mean, that's a timeless and sort of perennial part of it, right? We define monstrosity by its otherness, specifically from us. Monsters are going to look different to each person depending on their own activations, their own sensitivities, their own fears, right? Their own dreads. And probably a lot of that is like our own projections. Like, what are we most afraid of being ourselves? And how do we kind of point the finger at the other to make them more the other? Like, if we call attention to this phenomena, this specter, this figure, it'll call it away from ourselves, right? Like, oh, we're actually afraid of this thing. And I mean, it brings out that idea too of like the monster in each and every one of us that like hides in plain sight. And we see some of that, or at least some attempts for that often in the Dracula films. When can Dracula pass as nobility, right? How can he move through this upper echelon of society while still always kind of having this the scent of otherness about him, which might attract certain people, but also is like absolutely repulsive to others. It can't pass for long, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and the great reversal of it was Matheson's I Am Legend.
Mm,
I don't know if you've ever read it, but
yeah,
in I Am Legend, you're connecting with the narrator with I forget his name now, but you're connecting with the main character who is a human, and by the end you realize he's the bad guy now, because the others have become it. He is now the other,
yeah, yeah, absolutely. God, it's such a good point too. I mean, I know that when I'm also reading like the novel of Dracula, or even watching film depictions or renditions of it too, I mean, like the human characters are often super obnoxious, right? All of the suitors, I mean, there's things that are maybe charming or endearing about each and every one of them. But it often feels like Stoker's making fun of the humans, right? As much as he's building the dread around the vampire or the wives, right?
Yeah, yeah. Especially he has all the other characters make fun of Quincy without, you which is he's another other.
Yeah, yeah. You can really feel the cultural imagination of Stoker in that place too, being like, "Oh, what a cow!" Like what is this figment of already like already a monster, not just an American, but like an uncivilized, wild American. He gives him heroic dues at the end, but
Yeah, he really is like a bore to them.
yeah, yeah,
And the funny thing is, our depiction of him is like where we hear his funny accent and the way he talks, like a stereotypical cowboy. All comes from the other characters. We don't know if he really talks like
yeah.
that. That's just the way they perceive him.
I mean, that's a great point too, because we're also dealing with an epistolary kind of presentation of this information. I mean, automatically unreliable narrator, right? Which is I think like an unusual approach. It's something I love when I see within the horror genre, but it isn't something that you see with great frequency. People really want to rely on that kind of third person to build tension and suspense, but it throws a lot of this into, okay, how is the story being manipulated? Who might be covering what up? Like what individual transference is being shown by virtue of this sort of letter writing process and privilege to certain voices, right? Like who is being told and who is telling.
Yeah, and like they have Mina putting everything together, but at the same time they're trying to hide stuff from Mina.
Yeah, totally.
But I think the reason it's not done very often is because it's really hard to do well. You
Yeah.
know, it's rarely done. It's never done as well as he did it, and
Yeah.
it's rarely done in a way that it's not annoying. You know?
Yeah. It feels like I mean I've seen a couple recent endeavors that I thought had, relative success. But I think that the epistolary style is so associated with a particular like antiquated era too, that when people write within it as contemporary authors, they often find themselves veering toward more like Victorian tropes, or ways of right that kind of age the story. You are like, okay, well, I feel like you are using an affectation in the communication of
Yeah.
this.
So what we see more often and kind of works is the oral history. The oral history does a lot better in modern
Yeah.
times than epistolary.
What do you think that is, especially within the context of these constant retellings of Dracula's story that you get to encounter all the time when reading submissions?
What do I think? What is?
What do you think that the why the oral history seems to flourish now as opposed to
I think it goes back to what you were saying, where letters are dead. You know,
yeah,
and diaries for the most part. Not many people keep diaries or journals anymore. It's all blog or email,
yeah,
and so I think people have to try to find a way to modernize it.
yeah,
There was actually an adaptation of Dracula a couple years ago that's now antiquated, but it was called I Dracula, and it retold the story in a modern way through emails and blogs and Twitter feed, and it was very interesting. But as the way technology goes, that's not. I don't even think it's 10 years old, and it feels antiquated already.
yeah. God, I remember that coming out now. Actually, I hadn't thought about that in a long time. I mean, it is evident how depthful your knowledge is on this subject. Where did it originate? Like, where does this passion come from? What is it about Dracula that captivated you so deeply that this project arose?
It started. I always say it started as an act of rebellion. So when I was in the third grade, we had the Scholastic Book Fair at school, and I they gave out the catalog ahead of time so you could choose what you wanted to get, and then they would lead you down by class into the library to buy the
Yeah,
books from the book fair and all. And I saw Dracula in there. I can't remember specifically what cover it was, but I fell in love with the cover. I liked Count Chocula. I liked the Count of Sesame Street. So I'm like, I want to read that. So I went down with my money to buy that, and I went to Catholic school. So our elementary was first, eighth grade, and I was
yeah.
in third grade. And when I got down there, the librarian told me I wasn't allowed to buy that book.
Oh,
That book was only for the seventh and eighth graders. So I was bummed. I saved my money. I didn't buy anything that day, and I went home and I told my mom. And that night, she took me out to B. Dalton Bookstore, and we bought a copy of
oh,
Dracula. So I have since learned that the copy that I bought was the actual unabridged original text.
oh, wow.
The copy that I was going to buy at the book fair was abridged and adapted. So I
Hmm.
ended up making out in the deal. I'm sure. I mean, obviously, I can't remember what it was like that first time, but I'm sure I did not understand everything the first time I read it. It probably wasn't until high school that I actually got it. But
I love it. That initial spark of rebellion or like indignance about being told what you can or cannot have led to this. I mean, pretty prolific.
and I've probably read it at least once every 3 years since that first time.
And so, if this initial kind of spark for you was in perhaps the ordeal of attaining the thing, right? You already had this affinity, like you were saying, for some of the kind of cultural representations, Count Chocula. What is it that kept you coming back each time?
I think, like all great literature, it changes every time you read it.
Mm,
There is something different every time you read that book. So the first time I read it, I probably gravitated towards the first part of it. Because the first four chapters with Jonathan in the castle,
yeah,
that's scary, and there's nothing I don't think above a third grader's head in that.
yeah,
It can scare the hell out of you, but there's nothing above your head,
yeah,
except maybe the brides. You're probably not getting the eroticism of the brides, but you're getting the fear of the brides.
yeah.
Uh, then when it gets later into the book and you have all the romance, that I don't think that does it for an 8-year old.
No, no, that wasn't the priority there.
but but then it becomes an adventure after that. After the middle chapters, it becomes an adventure of them tracking Dracula down. So that brings you back in. But then every time you go back, so you go back as a teenager, now you're getting the eroticism at the
Yeah,
time when you want to get the eroticism, and like I said, every single time I read it, I either find something that I missed or forgot about. I didn't see the anti-Semitism in it until like 5 6 years ago.
yeah.
And not that there's a whole lot of it, but it is something that carries through in a lot of Stoker's work. No, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of Stoker's work.
Absolutely. I love this idea. I mean, this is probably true of, like you were saying, of all great stories, that they grow with you, right? Like the story is as much affected by the way in which and the time in which you read it as you are affected by the story you're reading. There's this real mutual reciprocity between the reader and the object, the story, the entity that's being read. And I like to think that we leave like little pieces of ourselves in every story that we encounter as well, that we, when we return to that story, maybe pick up again and incorporate back into ourselves. And it's changed a little bit. Like it's changed with time. It's changed by gestating or maturating in the story, but it is a process of kind of rediscovering the text and maybe rediscovering parts of ourselves too, right?
Yep. I have a friend who is a big fan of Moby Dick, and he said that we do kids a disservice by assigning that in high school because that is a middle-aged man's book.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've also uh, my daughter loves horror as well, and I tried to pass on my love of Stephen King to her
Yeah.
when she was younger, and I started with my favorite, which was Pet Cemetery, and I
Oh,
gave
yeah. Oh, God.
and she didn't like it. She put it down. So I was talking to another friend of mine who was a woman, and she said that's a boy's book. You got to give her Carrie or Misery or something to
Yeah.
start with, and then ease her into that. Once you're into Stephen King, you'll get that. But
Yeah.
each book is for somebody.
Absolutely. Yeah. I, God, my big entryway into Stephen King was Dreamcatcher, right? And that was it's an unusual entryway, I think. But we deal with some of the similar. Oh God, now I'm thinking about the movie and I'm getting upset, so I'm gonna swerve away from that subject. But yeah, I love the different audience is going to engage in different ways, and I mean that's probably one of the beauties of running this magazine too, right? Is seeing how each individual person relates to and engages and understands Dracula and the
It's so
characters. And
that part is so awesome
yeah,
because he's been he's been adapted so many different ways, and people found so many different ways into him, like as our starting point,
yeah,
that everybody has a different relationship with him. Now I'm a weirdo who has never met a Dracula story or a movie that I didn't like. Like
wow,
even the really terrible ones I love.
okay.
And so for me, like when I'm choosing the stories that come in from the submissions and all, I'm loving them. I'm just even the ones that I mean, some of them I'll get like 10 of essentially the same story over and
Yeah.
over, and I still like the nuances that make them different from each other. Even though at that point I know I'm not going to choose them because they're not.
Yeah.
If that many people came up with that idea, then that many people out in the world have that idea.
Totally.
But I'm always looking for something that's like off the wall. But I'm also at the same time trying to weigh them against each other and imagine everybody else's entry point so that I
Yeah.
have something for everybody in there. I
Mm.
people that like the Coppola film, I want romance stuff in there for him. I want where Dracula and Mina are star-crossed lovers. I want that in there. For people that prefer him to be a monster, I want that in there.
Yeah.
And I also do a thing where my wife, as strange as it may sound, has never read the original novel, and
Oh.
she's never seen any of the movies.
Oh.
She's a blank slate when it comes to Dracula.
Wow.
And for a long time, I was trying to get her to get into it and to watch it or read it or whatever. And then once I started this, like I said, I want it to be something for everybody, including people who have never read it before.
Yeah.
So whenever I'm not sure about a story, I give it to her and have her read it. And I say, "Does this make sense to you, having not read the book?" And if she says yeah, then it goes in. You know,
Amazing.
if she says I don't get it, then it goes out.
Now, has she not engaged with Dracula now so that she can is it a self-perpetuating thing because she's got this significant role? Is it that she's not interested or not a
She,
horror person or
she doesn't like to be scared,
okay.
so
That's
that's
probably
gonna
a
do it.
safer and saner way to navigate personal interests,
Yep.
um I love that though. So when you are you've done a really good job sort of explicating like what you're looking for when you choose a contribution, but what makes it feel like fresh with these stories that have been in some way or another sort of adapted and told and regurgitated and torn apart and packaged back together over and over again? What makes you like read a story and go like, oh yeah, this is something that needs to be brought forth?
So for the most part, it's kind of like an I know it when I see it type of
Hmm.
situation. But for me personally, I'm looking for something that's like completely outside the box.
Yeah.
They're the ones that I love.
Yeah.
Um, there's a writer that I've had the pleasure of publishing twice by the name of Amelia Mangan. She's out of Australia, and she's really good at thinking outside the box. She did one called RN in the Renfield book,
Okay.
where Renfield is a nurse in the birthing ward, and has Dracula housed in the ward
Yeah.
so that he can feed him babies. So
Yeah.
you got that, and then the most recent one in the Brides issue, she has a story called "What You Need to Do to Keep Her," and
Mm.
that is a second person story, which when it's hard to do well a second person story.
Yeah. It's
When it's done well, it can be one of my favorite things. I
yeah.
love, and she does that, and it's a cult member who the cult is clearly Dracula and his brides, but she's being reconstituted into her family,
Oh,
and it's so
wow,
good.
that sounds great.
Yeah, yeah, it's really a fantastic story. But I don't mean to just focus on her. I know that I'll be insulting all my other writers, but
No, no, no. Sure.
they're the ones that are sticking out right now as I'm
Yeah.
speaking to you.
I mean, I love you bringing up the particular way that she sees. I mean, it infuses it with something really electrifying, right? When you find,
Absolutely,
yeah.
it's something completely different. Then there is one series that runs through the entire book so far, uh, and there's going to be in the next one as well. It's a modern day, uh, and Dracula and Renfield run a private detective agency,
Oh, what
and,
amazing!
and that really speaks to me because part of the catalyst for this was in the 70s. There was a writer by the name of Jack Ritchie, and he wrote for Alfred Hitchcock magazine,
Oh,
and he wrote a series. It was 9 stories. It was called Cardula, The Adventures of Cardula. And Cardula was essentially Dracula who had been kicked out of Romania by the communists, and he came to America. In the first story, he tries to become a boxer, but after that, he becomes a private detective. And I love these stories, and they've never been collected. And I'm
yeah.
hoping that my experience of doing this magazine will allow me to contact the rights holders and bring in a collected version of the Cardula stories as well.
Oh my God, I
But
love
it's
that.
soon as I read the first installment of Henry Hirsch's stories that are in my books, it just reminded me of Cardula right away. I'm like, I have to do this.
It makes me think too. What it was I was listening to something the other day talking about how like out of anything in the history of film, Dracula has the most film credits. It's like 242 or something.
I think it's Dracula,
And then
Sherlock
Sherlock
Holmes,
Holmes. Yeah.
and Jesus.
Yeah. Which, and I mean, Jesus is beneath both Dracula and Sherlock Holmes. So that's really, I mean, it gives you perspective to like how large the figure of Dracula looms. It's 242 or something for Dracula, right? And then Sherlock Holmes is like 70 something.
So when I go out and I do conventions and book festivals and stuff, I have a sign on my table, and it's got a grid of like 9 different Draculas from the series from movies rather, and it says which one was your favorite. And people always look at it and start trying to come up based on that thing. And I always tell them, you can go off list because he's been portrayed over 200 times.
Yeah. I mean, what are some of your favorite depictions?
I am in love with Claes Bang from the Netflix series.
Okay, yeah. The one that came out recently, right? A
Yeah,
couple of
it's,
years ago. Yeah.
yeah, 2020. He he does such a fantastic job of taking the best parts of everybody that came before him and
Yeah.
combining them into one performance. It's just awesome. Because of that, he's become one of my favorite actors because
Yeah.
he's just great.
Yeah, I
Uh,
remember being really struck by in particular, the first episode where I was like, oh, here we go. Netflix is doing a Dracula thing. Well, a little bit prematurely judgmental on my part. And then I remember within the first 10 minutes being like, oh shit, like it's scary. Like
yeah,
he's a monster. Like
and
he's still charismatic and sexy, but he's a monster.
it gets Dracula's humor because
Yeah,
I always say that's missing because Dracula is funny in that book. I mean, it's a
yeah.
sadistic funny, but he's funny, and the way in that series, the way he calls Jonathan Johnny, I laugh. I've seen the series 6 times now. I laugh every single time he calls him Johnny. It just just there's something about the cadence of the way he says it. It's
Yeah.
just so funny.
He does a really good job with the sort of cat and mouse feeling, right, of
Yeah.
Dracula and Johnny, where
You know,
Dracula's just so much smarter.
when I talk to people about it, people always say that they enjoyed it, but really found problems with the third episode.
Yeah.
And I say go back and watch it, rewatch it because that third episode I think was meant to be rewatched because there's so much stuff hidden in that there's all kinds of little Easter eggs for people
Yeah.
that have been uh, watching everything, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I will rewatch it too because I remember having that same response where I mean I remember enjoying it, but being a little bit like something felt like this episode existed outside of the prior.
And also,
Um,
if you're a Ted Lasso fan, Jamie Tart is in it, and nobody remembers that.
oh no. So okay, so you love this particular. Where do you stand on some of the other ones, especially some of the films that come to mind immediately for people? The Nosferatu. Are you excited for the new
I am
Nosferatu?
so excited. If I were to make that Nosferatu movie, that is the cast I would choose.
Amazing, yeah. Uh, Bill Skarsgård is doing a good job at being incredibly creepy in
Yeah,
things. Yeah.
always, always.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think that's why Barbarian works so well. I don't know if you saw
Yes.
that or not,
Yeah.
but that twist in the middle is because of how he's so creepy. It only works because of that.
Yeah, I mean, what a privilege and a blessing. Make your career around. I mean, like we need that. You'll never go out of work if you're
Yep.
like the guy that can be the monster, right? Like if you're the guy that can make everyone
When,
upset, but
roles, when those roles dry up, you just do the convention circuit.
yeah, or you sign things for a living, and there you go. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I love the nod by bringing Willem Dafoe into. I mean, it's such
Yep.
a he's just so iconically associated, right, with that kind
And
of.
Nicholas Holt goes right from Renfield to
Yes.
Harker.
What did you think? What did you think of Renfield?
I loved it while I recognize that it's not for everybody.
Yeah.
Um, to me, like I tell people all the time, it's a secret superhero movie.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
totally.
it's got the playfulness of a Marvel movie. He turns into a superhero when he eats the bugs, and it's violent. It's a very violent
Yeah,
movie,
it is.
but a cartoonish violence.
Yeah, I thought it was. I mean, I think that allowing like levity and humor to infiltrate actually helps create this sort of like trans sometimes like a pretty transgressive complement to a lot of gore or a lot of graphic kind of blood. And I'll be real, like I'll watch anything with Nicolas Cage in it. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
the
Oh,
quality of the
absolutely.
camera doesn't matter, you know. I'll sign me up, take my money. But it was also great to see Nicholas Hoult, I think, like come into he has been typecast. I know I think he played a zombie in a movie that came out a while ago too that was interesting. But he gets kind of I think typecast a lot and seeing him break into this kind of film climate is exciting as well because he's great. He's a great actor.
Yeah, he is.
His timing is really special. Uh I'm worried I'm I'm wondering too, right? Like after all this time, I mean, you're watching all these films, like you could the deep cuts, the popular standards too. What mysteries like are still unanswered for you with Dracula? What like calls to you over and over again that you're hoping is going to be maybe answered in the stories you receive or the films you watch?
As far as I'm concerned, there has never been a great Scholomance story. Scholomance
Oh,
is
yeah,
Scholomance is where Dracula became, in
yeah,
theory, became a vampire.
yeah.
You're taught the secrets of the universe by the devil, and then he chooses one to be his apprentice, and that's supposedly where
Yeah.
Dracula became Dracula. And there's never been a great story about that time. You know,
It's such a fixture in the folklore of the region too, right? Like this is very much believed to be a real thing. Like this, people will share stories of the different Skull monsters that they know in real life, and the phenomenon, the kinship, sort of the imagery that Dracula gets too, right, over and over again with dragons, because the Eastern European dragon is such a part of that particular corpus of folklore as well, and the weather magic that's associated with that, and the storms that Dracula seems to have all that control over, and then the shape shifting between the werewolf voodoo-like like kind of form. And I mean that, yeah, that would be an amazing story.
yeah.
Maybe that's a future call for submissions.
I, well, that is part of the plan.
Okay.
I have I have all the character themes first, and then
Yeah.
after I'm done all the main characters, then Stoker becomes his own book.
Yeah.
I want to do Scholomance. At one point, I was contemplating doing a whole issue on the Demeter, but I don't. I
What,
think that's out of the cards now. I want to do a
because
Dracula
of the
Noir.
film or because or for
No,
other
just
reasons?
I don't think there's a lot there. I don't think there's enough there.
Hmm.
I thought at one time that there might be, but I don't think there is.
I could see
Uh,
how there'd be like repetition. You're only working with like a very narrow scope of tools there.
if I found like a decent novella or something, I might do a novella
Yeah.
and maybe some nonfiction. But other than that, I think I'm skipping that one. I want to do a Dracula Noir.
Yeah.
Um, I want to do a crossover issue with other like Sherlock Holmes, Frankenstein,
You.
stuff.
Yeah.
There's been some of that sprinkled in as we go along, but I want to dedicate issues to that. I have a whole list somewhere. I forget them off the top of my head, but I had a when I first started the project, I had about 20 issues like mapped out.
Yeah.
And it all depends on the submissions if they actually work or not.
Totally. So your process of putting you take one of the ideas, you throw out the idea, you see what submissions come, and if you get like a corpus, like enough work that really feels like something you can get behind, that's the issue. Um,
So kind of I have a set plan for the order that I want them to be in, and I put that out there. Right? So when the when I was taking submission for the brides issue,
yeah,
I also let them know that the next one was going to be the.
suitors. Yeah,
And then now that I'm taking for the suitors, I'm letting people know that the next one is for Harker, because like a traditional, like I'm a writer as well. When I'm going through
yeah,
submission calls, I might have a story laying around that fits their theme,
yeah,
but most people don't have a Lucy's suitors story sitting around,
yeah.
so they need time to prepare that if they're interested in it. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's exciting to think about, especially once the primary characters have been approached, the different places this can go, right? Like I'm always really curious about what all the different, whether it's the villagers, whether it's the Roma people, all the people that exist in sort of the ecosystem around Dracula. Like, what would a perspective told from like a barmaid in one of the village taverns where everyone's gathered together on like Walpurgis Night, right, and talking about stories about Dracula. Like, what would that kind of look like from the unmentionables of the story, those that sort of create that filler perspective? I mean, you get so many interesting approaches for like a dialogic piece. Like, what is a story that looks specifically like two people passing back and forth rumors that they've heard about Dracula over and over again? There's just so much room there. It's exciting to know that you'll never literally run out of possibilities for issues.
Yeah, yeah, it's so much fun. It's a lot of work, but it's so much fun.
Yeah. What is that? I mean, do you find that this is like a thing that you stay up like late working on and whatever free time you can kind of conjure, or have you made it designated, this is each day, this is my Dracula scheduled time?
Believe it or not, I'm not a night person.
Okay.
I'm a morning person, so I wake up early in the morning and do it. Usually, I because I still have a day job as well, so usually I leave my reading time for the weekends, and
Yeah.
I'll wake up like 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning and just read until everybody else in the house is up.
Well, it's still kind of a night vibe. It's dark out. You get it. Dracula can still come and visit you
Yep.
during that period of time, right? Like, you're in that window at least. What do you what do you think that Dracula is still trying to teach us, like as people? Or what do you maybe feel like you still wish to teach others about Dracula?
Well, there are two different questions there. um, so I'll answer the second one.
Yeah,
Yeah, I used to be one of those nerds who would get really mad at people when they got excited about movies where Dracula was destroyed by sunlight. And I'd be like, no, he can walk in daylight. If you've read the book, he can walk in daylight.
yeah,
But I've not only given up on that, I think it's stupid. I think it's stupid to be that much of a stickler to the original text. But I do wish people knew that he could walk in
yeah,
daylight. I also I've started within the last couple years developing this theory. Dracula was at the time that it came out, it was marketed as a mystery,
mm,
and the people who were originally reading it weren't like us. They didn't go into it knowing he was a vampire. And I've become of the opinion that if you read that book up until it's revealed that he's a
yeah,
vampire, Stoker's trying to convince you it's a werewolf.
yeah,
Jonathan on his way to the castle is being followed by a dog. He has power over the wolves. He's got hairy palms. He's got long
yeah.
fingernails. I think he's trying to convince you he's a werewolf and then trick you into when he reveals it as a vampire.
Mm.
And I think that is borne out by, if you read Stoker's notes, he was reading a lot of werewolf books.
Totally. And it's interesting too. A lot of the folklore of Eastern Europe does not significantly divide between
Yeah,
the werewolf and the vampire, right? I mean, both of these stories are so tremendously popular in culture, and now they're really separate from each other, right? Like, when you think of like the monster mashup, you've got the Frankenstein, you've got the vampire, you've got the werewolf, you've got the mummy, right? You have this whole kind of assimilation. But in so much of the folklore, sometimes these things are really relatively like interchangeable, or there's a sort of hybridization, or you can shapeshift into the bat but also into the bird and into the wolf and all of these things. And I think it's this exciting way for people that are, I mean, to dig into deeper understanding that, like, Stoker was doing research on
yeah,
what
he
he
did
was
a
reading
lot of.
anthropological and folklore. He was traveling and getting stories. It wasn't just fully kind of the abstraction of the imagination, or him like mixing up the vampire and the werewolf trope.
Yeah, he did a whole lot of research. I'm in Philadelphia, so we have the Rosenbach here, and the Rosenbach is a museum that holds the notes that he took while he was writing the book, and it's
Wow.
just awesome. That is part of the Rosenbach is part of what led to this specific project.
Yeah.
So during the pandemic, they weren't allowed to let people in the doors, but they wanted to keep people engaged. So they started an online program called Sundays with Dracula, and it was Dracula takes place over 27 weeks from May to November. It's exactly 27 chapters, and they came up with an idea to start in May and end in November and read a chapter a week with a group of experts.
Oh,
So they called me up and asked me to be part of that show. So I became part of that show. And during the course of one of the episodes, somebody in the audience asked if there was a database of all the stories that Stoker didn't write that used his
yeah.
characters. And at that particular time, there was not an extensive database. So within the week, there was. I bought the domain name Dracula Beyond Stoker.com, and I built that database. So you can go on and find, and it's ongoing. It, I haven't updated in about 6 months because I fell behind doing the book.
Yeah.
During the course of doing that, I was going out and I would find something I hadn't heard of before. So I would have to track it down and buy it. And some of them I still haven't been able to, but it got very, very expensive. So I decided,
Yeah, imagine.
I decided to start this magazine to continue on with new stories, but also to bring the older stories back into print. So people that are goofy like me don't have to spend hundreds of dollars to get one story in a Alfred Hitchcock magazine. You
Yeah.
know?
I love it. It you have the role of the archivist, really. You're doing this work of sustaining and preserving the sort of living, breathing, growing museum of what Stoker started, but he certainly won't be the one to finish, right?
I don't think anybody will finish it. I think it's
Yeah.
going to go on and on.
I love that. That's one a comforting thing in its own way,
Yeah.
right? I mean, when
Yes
we
and
think
no.
about it,
Yes and no,
no,
because
yes and no. Where's the no come from there?
I hate the idea that I will die without having read them all.
Oh, no. You're gonna have to find a way to keep living, I guess. Then maybe this is your reward at the end of the journey is that Dracula's gonna need to make sure that you stay alive for an eternity to continue to do justice to his legacy. You're like, I don't know about that part.
Yeah,
You're like,
yeah. Eternity is more frightening than dying without reading them all.
okay. Oh yeah. If you had to choose between one or the other, you're gonna, yeah. Eternity. That's real. We don't know what eternity looks like. We don't need to turn this into like the last man alive, right?
Yeah.
So before we kind of settle down, this is a question that has really, I think, come up a few times and we were talking about, but I would love to also kind of address a little bit more directly because I think that the relationship between eroticism and terror manifests throughout the stories less in the novel than the various movie adaptations or kind of cultural representations. And also, I think some of this is the fixation on the hypersexuality of like the vampiric woman, right? But in your opinion, how much of this do you think is rooted or is born within the actual story that Stoker wrote, as opposed to how it has been kind of devoured or fixated on by the public over time and its different iterations?
So I think the eroticism is definitely there. There's no. I don't think romance is there, but
Yeah,
eroticism is. Um, I mean, the scene with Jonathan and the brides is extremely erotic.
yeah,
Um, I think the scene with Lucy and Arthur after she's turned and
yeah,
she's like, "Come to me, Arthur." That's more seductive than erotic, but they can be interchangeable.
yeah,
Um, I think Dracula is more rapey than erotic, but
yeah. No, I mean it's but that's part of the again. It's a we're talking about monsters. We're not talking about if Dracula might know social convention, right? He might be able to play with it or mask with it or manipulate that sort of social convention, but by no means does he feel um, that he must perform it, right? That he must
Oh,
obey it. Or,
he doesn't feel bound by it at all.
yeah, no.
He can pretend, he can play a good game, but
Which I mean makes that's the scarier monster, right? One that knows convention, but like can actively choose to undermine it. That's a harder monster to pick out sometimes.
yep.
Yeah,
And
oh, go ahead.
it's a harder monster to contain too.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in my own personal kind of like retconned imagination, I like the idea that Dracula does not die, right? Like Dracula ends up on a ship to some. I mean, so many stories go with that particular thread, right? He didn't actually die. He ends up somewhere else. He ends up, in the new world. He ends up is somewhere traveling through the tropics. There's like a lot of different ways that goes, but it's for a monster who means nothing good for the world, right? Does not view humans with respect or humanity with respect. It's very easy to root for Dracula, right? Like it's very easy to still read that story, I think, and find yourself pleased or kind of vicariously satisfied through the. I mean, maybe I'm outing myself in a way I shouldn't here, actually, but I find like he's still one of the more easy to love characters within the story. Maybe this is also my bias against many of the suitors and the other characters, just like annoying.
Well, it's been done a couple times, specifically in the Dracula tape by Fred Saberhagen,
Yeah.
and there was another one called Dracula, or spelled differently, but by Earl Lee, and they pretty much present it as Dracula's point of view, where he was the good guy and they were being dicks to him.
Yeah.
He had to do what he had to do.
Yeah. Totally. Well, what's coming up for you, Tucker? We know that Brides is this in the editing process right now.
Brides is out.
How
Brides
it's
came out
really it's
last
out.
week.
It's really that's right. I can't believe I've shared it. I can't believe you went fast on that too because
It's every 6 months.
it what how do you that turnaround is crazy, especially for having a job. Yeah.
I really subscribe to the pulp mentality. It's just grind them out.
Yeah.
That one
And
that one was that one was tough though because I got a lot of stories for that one. It was a lot of reading, and I actually fell behind for a while. I didn't think I was going to get it out on time.
more than the prior
That one got
issue.
more than the prior ones. Now the suitors one, I'm getting scared of how little I'm getting, but I knew they would be a hard sell. But I'm not I'm not even at a third of where I normally am
Wow.
at this point in the process, which
Okay,
is
so for people that are hearing this, get writing your suitor stories.
I'm going out to Stoker Con next week,
Okay.
which is the convention for the horror
Yeah,
writers
that's going to be
association.
real fun.
So and I've got cards made up to hand out to people like what I'm looking for. So I'm hoping to get some out there, get people
Yeah,
in.
I love it. Yeah, really promulgate the suitor. I mean, I think that the in the ways in which the suitors might be more quote unquote challenging than say the brides, right? Where everyone's got an obsession and a fixation with the bride. They live
Yeah,
rent free in so many people's like formative erotic imaginations. Maybe again I'm outing myself here. But I think that the suitors are sort of often perceived as kind of flatter characters, right? But that makes
yeah,
it more generative and more exciting. You have so much spaciousness, so much room to work with as far as generating a character.
and their backstories are kind of hinted at.
Yeah,
Stoker tells us that they adventured together.
yeah,
They were what happened in Korea.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And there's a whole conspiracy theory amongst some groups of fans that Quincy was in cahoots with Dracula himself.
Yeah,
So tell me about that.
I mean that's what. I mean, you get to do so much fun, like mythic Wild West cowboy stuff with Quincy, and I don't when like the Western kind of horror is done well. It's chef's kiss. It's
Yeah.
so good. I mean, you get to play with so much convention there, both historically and, I mean, tell us a story where Quincy's a monster hunter, right? Like in the comes there's so much there. Yeah, I really hope that you get
There,
more
there
for
was
that. But I
there was a novel a couple years ago by P. and Elrod. It was Quincy Morris Vampire, and it was Quincy didn't die; he was turned at the end.
ah
And
love it.
it's really great.
Yeah, it's awesome. Okay, so when are submissions open till?
Submissions are open. They've been open for 3 weeks now, and they go until the 15th of June.
Okay.
If I need to extend it, I will extend it, but I'm hoping I don't have to.
Okay, great. Then and this will be up before then, so we'll make sure that everyone knows it's open. And yeah, I mean this is fun. We already have the theme after revealed as well. You're going to StokerCon, so everyone that it's in LA this year, right?
San Diego.
San Diego, there we go. So everyone that's coming to San Diego can make sure to hunt you down and grab some issues. And you mind telling everyone where they can find you? I'll put
Yeah,
it in the show notes as well. But
we're at dbspress.com. So Dracula Beyond Stoker Press.com. And all the social media is either DBS Press or Dracula Beyond Stoker. I'm on all of them. So I mean, I'm even on TikTok, even though I never update it.
sometimes it's just good to be a place. You got one hand, one of many hands in all locations. But I mean, you could always start reading issues aloud on the TikTok, get people in that way, have a new Dracula ASMR alternate timeline channel all of your own. Amazing, Tucker. This has been such a blast.
Yeah, it's been a
Do
lot
you
of
have
fun.
anything else you want to share before we wind down?
I don't think so. Um, you know what? I did want to give a shout out to there was a there was an opera that came out a couple years ago
Oh yeah.
called The Lord of Cries. It was done at the Santa Fe Opera
Oh
House,
wow.
and I should have wrote down the website where you can download it. But if you can download that when you buy it, you download it and it comes with all the notes and the full
Yeah.
book and all, and it's really fantastic. It combines the characters and the basic outline of the Dracula story with the story of Dionysus.
Oh what?
Yeah, it's really and the music is
Amazing.
the music is fantastic. The story is incredible. I really recommend it if you're an
Ah,
opera fan. You
yeah.
know, I'm a fan of all music, so I really speaks
Yeah.
to me. But I know some people can't get into opera, and I understand why. But
I love opera personally, so The Lord of Cries is the name?
yeah, Lord of Cries.
And that's a amazing name
Yep.
too. Yeah, and I know there was a ballet that came out that I've seen.
There's been a couple
That's yeah.
ballets. I've never seen any of them. I did see the one that was the movie, the Asian movie. I can't remember.
Oh, I don't think I know that one. Yeah, I just recently had a friend bring it to my attention. But an opera sounds incredible, especially bringing in some of the Dionysian stuff as well. I'm probably going to check that out immediately after we get off this recording. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
It has been such a pleasure. I feel really, really lucky to have you as kind of one of the inaugural guests in this. We can't talk about monsters without talking about Dracula, and I don't know at this point if we can really talk about Dracula without bringing you in to talk about him too. So
I
it has
appreciate
meant so much to me, and I thank you for making this time on your incredibly busy schedule.
that. Thank you.
Awesome, Tucker. You have a wonderful day.
You too.
Bye.